bravery is contagious, but so is cowardice. And I want them to surround themselves by people who inspire them, but also, but also lead by example.
One for Mum, one for Dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared. The Treasurer knows.
I want an economy that works for people, not the other way around.
We'll just end up being a third-rate economy, a banana republic.
Just follow the money.
G'day, and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast that explains economics, politics, and policy in plain English. I'm your host, Ebony Bennett. Too often, women are told to take a backseat, to stay quiet, to let the boys handle things, but Australia is full of women who refuse. Antoinette Lattouf is an award-winning journalist, presenter, podcaster, author, and human rights advocate.
In December 2023, I shared a Human Rights Watch post because Human Rights Watch found that Israel was using starvation as a weapon of war in Gaza.
Today, Antoinette Lattouf emphatically won her legal battle with the ABC. The court has decisively upheld her claim that the ABC illegally dismissed her from her employment.
Today the court has found that punishing someone for sharing facts about these war crimes is also illegal.
Her landmark victory in Lattouf versus ABC became a flashpoint in debates about free speech, employee rights, institutional cowardice, and what happens when a journalist speaks truth to power. Her latest book, Women Who Win, is an examination of female courage and conviction and how that has changed our country. This week, we're bringing you an extract of my conversation with Antoinette, recorded live on Friday the 29th of May as part of our Australia's Biggest Book Club webinar series. We spoke about her successful legal battle against the ABC and some of the inspiring women she covers in the book. I started by asking Antoinette about the genesis of Women Who Win, which came in the aftermath of her unlawful termination from the national broadcaster.
So I was about 9 or 10 months into what would become a 2.5-year very public and legal battle. And I, at that point, was really suffering from a lot of anxiety, and I was having panic attacks at night and insomnia. And in those sort of most isolating moments at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, when I thought, what am I doing? How am I going to do this? How is this one casual presenter going to face off against the national broadcaster, smear campaigns from the Murdoch media, and the pro-Israel lobby breathing down my neck and wanting me to shut up? And so I realized I had three pretty strong adversaries, opponents. And so in those moments when I'm up at night, I turned to other women. I started to research other women throughout Australia's history who did things that people would have thought was mad or impossible. And that became what I just like to describe as an IV drip of courage. And it was a little bit of me being delirious and not knowing what to do. I would typing furiously away, like, women who didn't take shit, powerful Australian women, and I had all these crazy search words trying to just find women. And I would comfort myself and try and slow my heart rate by reading their stories and then reading the way they were depicted in the media at the height of their battles. And then that gave me a bit of comfort, going, okay, well, we know how this works. They're being attacked, they're being maligned, they're being this, and then they're later revered. They were right. They were just right too soon. And so that really was the genesis of the book. And then I pitched it to my publisher, Penguin, who I previously written a book with. This was in between the Fair Work Commission trial and the federal court. And they signed me up, they signed the book deal. And this is at a time where I was professionally blacklisted. Nobody was going.
Yeah.
And they signed off on it, and they signed off on the title, Women Who Win, before I'd even won.
So obviously the book is part memoir of that experience, and it's part telling all these other women's stories. But sticking with your story for a minute, I can only imagine as a journalist, you're normally reporting on the stories, you're not the story itself. How different was and destabilizing was that experience for you at the time as a journalist in particular?
Yeah, I think there were two things going on at the moment. I was the story, but I was the story from December 2023, and I was a story because I was being made an example of. And it was very much a warning shot to other journalists to not criticize Israel, to turn away from basic journalistic practice of relying on reputable sources. And it really had a chilling effect on the industry. So I knew what I was doing on the one hand was being a story and not allowing the story to play out in the way that lobbyists and the Murdoch media wanted it to go was important, not only for me and my professional reputation, because I was smeared as somebody who was breaching editorial policy, breaching social media policy, not listening to a manager, being a Holocaust denier.
Yeah.
They completely tried to ruin my legacy and my impact as a journalist. And it's wild that it took 2.5 years for me to prove that I did none of those things. And that actually gave more confidence to other journalists to keep doing their jobs without having to pander to whatever the latest campaign by the Australian newspaper is, or whatever pro-Israel lobbyists want us to do. At the same time, I knew how to use my role in the media and my understanding of the media. I know a thing or two about narratives myself. And so perhaps what they underestimated was my ability to push a counter narrative, to not allow my story and my journey and my demise to be determined by tabloid press attacks or gaslighting by ABC management, because they continued to gaslight me. And so because I didn't go quietly, because I kept putting things out, I was strategic in the way I interacted with the media. That was also something I think that perhaps the people who were targeting me didn't expect. And thirdly, I used that opportunity as somebody who was being spoken about so much and whose win, in the end I did win, was well known, to be like, well, there are all these other Australian women who don't have the platform I have, who don't have the profile I have, who've done so many incredible things, and their stories aren't told. And just looking in the chat, I see that Janice Duffy is in the chat. And Janice Duffy is actually in my book. Dr. Janice Duffy, shout out to you. She's an incredible woman who self-represented against Google in a defamation case and won twice. She won twice and set precedent in defamation law that search engines can be liable for defamatory material that is published online that they won't take down. And so there are incredible women like Janice and a whole bunch of other women whose stories aren't known, whose names aren't known. And I quite frankly got sick of seeing my own name and face in headlines. And I thought, well, how can I redirect this into something that's really constructive and galvanizing for other Australians?
So before we come to some of those other stories that you feature in the book, like Janice Duffy's story, and just sticking with you initially, for those who are unfamiliar with your case, I know it got a huge number of headlines, but I'm sure some people are still unfamiliar with the actual details of the case. What were you actually dismissed for, if you can just relate that story for everyone?
The week I got dismissed, I was hosting local radio in Sydney. It's a magazine-style program. In the lead up to Christmas, I was filling in on a 5-day contract. At that point in my career, I was a freelancer doing a bunch of different things across different networks. I very much liked it. My role was outside of news and current affairs, but from day one of being in the building at the ABC, pro-Israel lobbyists flooded management and the board's emails with coordinated campaigns to have me sacked. It wasn't anything I did on air, unless people took issue with the music I played and the talkback segments I did. It was simply because on my social media platforms and in an investigation I had done previously for Crikey, it was clear that I was critical of Israel's war crimes in Gaza. I had spoken about the amount of journalists who'd been killed. At that point, it was close to 100. Starvation was being used as a tool of war, which Human Rights Watch Post had been reporting. And so the thing that they pinged me on, so to speak, or tried to, was a Human Rights Watch post that I shared on my social media account, my Instagram story, on day 3 of my 5-day shift. Now, the ABC had already reported on this twice. I was already aware that I was being targeted because my direct manager had told me on day 1. She was like, look, I'm going to have to tell you this. You're doing really well on air. It's got nothing to do with on air, but lobbyists aren't happy that you're on air. And we have been inundated with complaints. So we had already had this conversation, which is kind of horrible to know that you're being surveilled already. Like you're not doing anything, but you're being surveilled. I knew that. That this is the sort of the environment journalists have to operate within, but also I'm Lebanese, and so I knew that I had extra scrutiny. And so I had agreed with my direct manager that, look, I said, look, while I'm on air, I'll just share from reputable sources. I'm not going to share conjecture. I'm not going to share commentary. And so that was what we agreed on. So when I came to post the Human Rights Watch post, I did it fully aware that of this conversation, fully aware of the fact that I was being watched, but also I wasn't going to back down. Pro-Israel lobbyists who support a state committing genocide aren't going to tell me what I can and can't post in my stories, what facts I can or can't post. So I did it knowing I was being watched, but knowing that if it was any other day, I would still share this. And that's my prerogative. And so after I shared that post, I was called into my middle manager's office. There were three managers, and they essentially told me that I was to leave the building, that my post had brought my impartiality into question and it brought the ABC into disrepute. And I was shocked. I started to cry. I had to quickly get my bags and leave the building. And I filed my unlawful termination case, probably, I think, the next day.
I mean, yeah, for someone who, as you say, like your professional reputation is someone, always following editorial policy, a fearless journalist, that must have been hugely confronting to kind of essentially be escorted from the building. And so I guess knowing that you had made that decision, that on any other day you would have posted that kind of thing, I do want to talk about the brave fights that other women have been involved in that you highlighted in the book. And I guess protest was a powerful theme that comes through many of the stories in the book. And I want to ask about Amal Nasser and Palestine Action and Marwa Johnson in particular. I was already familiar with Marwa Johnson's story, but not so much some of the other stories in there. Can you just comment on, I guess, the role of protest in contemporary Australian civil society and why you thought some of those stories were so important to relate?
Sure. Just for a bit of context for those who haven't read the book, it's really quite varied. I start from colonization to now. The chapters are divvied up thematically, whether it's sport or science or climate or the law. And I try and show really sort of intersectional battles that women have faced. And something that comes up again and again, and was particularly pertinent in this political climate, was protest, because we have, in the past few decades, our right to protest has been legislated against increasingly, and it was largely to begin with targeting the climate change movement and climate activists. We've seen some of the most sort of draconian laws passed. I do look at protest under peril reports that have come out. And this was largely to do with the climate change movement, but we've seen in recent years and even in recent months how politicians are trying to curb protests. And in New South Wales in particular was found to be unconstitutional. Chris Minns's anti-protest laws, just to make President Herzog's visit a little bit more comfortable for him, that they were in fact unconstitutional. And so what we're seeing is demonizing of people's ability to assemble. And we know historically people assembling is what has enacted a lot of change. And so I wanted to analyze sort of the genesis of the attacks on protests. If protests weren't effective, then power wouldn't work so hard to suppress them. So Marwa Johnson, I don't know how much you want me to go into detail into Marwa Johnson, or do you want me to talk about Amal Nasser?
I might get you to reflect on both, because I do think there's that difference there between the climate protesters and now these same laws and things being enforced against protests of other kinds for civil rights and other things. But do you want to start with Marwa's story?
Yeah, so Marwa Johnson's an incredible First Nations woman in Queensland. And she's really quite incredible. As a young woman in her early 20s, she was part of a coalition of young people who for the first time invoked the Queensland Human Rights Act as a way to stop a billionaire coal mine from not only harming the environment, but also for the impact it would have on First Nations sacred land. And we're able to prove before the courts that this isn't just, bad for the environment. It also has enormous cultural significance and impact for the local First Nations people. And so it was the first time the Human Rights Act, invoking First Nations human rights, was able to stop the expansion of a coal mine. And I think what's incredible about her, during the trial, she was heavily pregnant. The trial just finished. She thought she was a little bit sick with COVID. She actually went straight into labor. And then by the time it was verdict time, she was there with her young daughter. And immediately she was like, right, which billionaire is next? Like, who are we? We've set this precedent. Who are we stopping next? And so, she's a really incredible person. Amal Nassad is part of the Palestine Action Group, and she was one of the applicants. She's a Palestinian Australian lawyer, and she in her 20s, and she was one of the applicants who got the Harbour Bridge March, the March for Humanity, approved, which it faced enormous opposition from the police, and because they knew how politically significant it would be as well. And it was so politically significant. It was the largest anti-war protest I think we've ever seen. I certainly haven't seen crowds that large since at least the Iraq War, more than 20 years ago. And it was a really cold, rainy day. And so I speak about sort of her personal journey, why she went into the law, and how the law is actually being weaponized in this moment against those who criticize Australia's allegiance with the state committing genocide, and also just how tricky that was for her. I was also part of the March for Palestine, or the March for Humanity, and then also saw how quickly sections of the media tried to either underestimate how many people were there, or tried to shift the focus onto something else, as though this was a safety concern, or this is I don't know, just so many things. But what was so significant is no matter which way it was politicized, or what the anti-Semitism envoy tries to say about it, in the immediate aftermath of the terrible Bondi attacks, the anti-Semitism envoy, even before our Prime Minister or AFP had spoken, had sought to make a connection with those who were marching on the Harbour Bridge, which is so dangerous, which is so unfair. And so anyway, so that's part of the examination of protest.
I want to talk next about child sexual abuse survivor and activist Grace Tame, who features in the book, and I think you described as a human flamethrower. She was recently labelled as difficult by the Prime Minister, obviously a badge of honour for someone like Grace, but obviously this book is full of women who I'm sure would attract similar labels. But do you think that's the kind of thing that gets applied to women more so than anybody else trying to seek change? And
absolutely,
yeah,
absolutely.
How much are women, I guess, fighting against those kinds of stereotypes or efforts to diminish and dismiss what they're trying to do?
Yeah, so two things that emerged quite clearly from my examination of a whole bunch of women. So I interview about 30 women who are alive, and I profiled a bunch of significant women who are no longer with us. One of the things that is most telling, and sadly continues today, so whether it is the first woman to study law in the early 1900s to Grace Tame today, or even me, is the way the media represents and speaks about women. And so I spent a lot of time in newspaper archives, even about First Nations women in the 1800s, or convict women. And I found it really curious and strangely comforting that the tools of intimidation used by the media have almost become predictable. You'd like to think that we've evolved, and in some ways we have, but some of the attacks are so sinister and so overt. So women have always been portrayed this way. And then, as I say, usually posthumously or belatedly revered. That's sort of one main theme. The other thing is how precarious a win can be and how things are never necessarily set in stone. And so there are some areas in the book in where I examine, for example, Wendy McCarthy, who spent a lot of time on reproductive women's rights. She was one of the women at the forefront of advocating so that men could be in birthing suites with women. And so despite the fact that in the 70s, she took out a full-page advertisement with other women at the time when abortion was a crime in New South Wales, admitting that they'd had an abortion and taunting police to come and arrest them. Now in her 80s, she's still advocating for the right for women to access safe abortions, because there are parts of regional New South Wales, particularly from the region where she hails from, where doctors can now opt out on be conscientious objectors or on moral grounds, and so there are sometimes or some instances where women have to travel hundreds of kilometers to access abortion. So she's at a point in her 80s where she's like, things are being wound back. And so we have to be forever vigilant and always active. And I'm conscious of the fact that Grace Tame, while being revered and while being awarded Australian of the Year and being recognised for what she's done for sexual abuse survivors, can also be a target of attack, which we have seen in recent months. So you can be celebrated as a winner, but there are sectors of society that would love to see you either be really difficult or love to orchestrate your downfall. And it's something that I'm conscious of now, even speaking to you. I'm like, okay, well, this is in front of however many people. There could probably someone from the Murdoch press tuning in to see what I say. It's going to be on YouTube. I know that there comes this enormous pressure for people wanting to drag us down. And we could say that perhaps applies to Australians more broadly. It's not just, perhaps not just women, that we have a bit of a tall poppy syndrome, but it's particularly sinister. And our missteps can be tiny. You can say one misplaced adjective and it could spell your downfall. Whereas we've seen men in particular, I can speak about media, do the most horrible things and still get a promotion.
Your mum is a strong presence in the book, and at one point you're kind of reflecting on what walking away from that legal battle that you were in would mean, perhaps a betrayal of both your mum but also yourself. How has your mum responded to this book, and how was she part of your journey while you were going through that legal battle?
My mum was a refugee. She came from Lebanon in the 70s. Because of poverty, she was pulled out of school when she was 10 years old. And then because of the Civil War, was displaced and came to Australia. Because of my mum's circumstances and her limited education, she's unable to read my book. And so she can't read my book. She doesn't understand. She can read like very limited English and has a very basic grasp. So, but the sort of support she provided and the strength was, unwavering, same as my father. And I don't want to spoil it, but there's a section where I begin to understand why. And it's things that my mother endured and experienced that I had never known before only came to surface in the past couple of years. I think a lot of the trauma that she suppressed was reignited because of what what we've all been witnessing in high definition on our phones for 2.5 years. And so it also made me understand the sort of grit and resilience I have and my deep care for humans and decency and human rights. Again, that will become clearer once I learned about my mother's own journey.
And you dedicated the book to your daughters. What lessons would you hope that they would take from this book after reading it?
I just hope that they use, they're so enormously privileged in a way that I never was growing up. I went to a public school. My parents were very working class. I was one of 7 children at a time in the so-called war on terror, where it was very difficult to be proud of being Lebanese, be proud of speaking Arabic in public. I hope that they can have more pride in their heritage and connection to we're meant to be taking them to Lebanon for the first time later this year, but I don't know, the attacks have intensified, so I don't know if it's safe to do so. I just hope that they always do the right thing, even if it's the hard thing to do. I hope that I've been able to demonstrate to them that we need more people to be brave, and bravery is contagious, but so is cowardice. And I want them to surround themselves by people who inspire them, but also lead by example. I can only hope.
And I guess I wondered if you had drawn any different lessons, or if you learned something or something came out of the book that was unexpected to what you're expecting when you went into it at the start and started interviewing all these women and telling their story. Is there anything about being in these battles that you weren't aware of, or that other people might not be aware of when you take on these kinds of fights?
Look, it definitely changes you. And 29 of the 30 women I interview in this book have all said they would do it again. And I'm not going to share who or why. They won't. I would do it again. But it certainly is a heaviness and something you carry forever, even if you have one. It can be quite bruising. And that journey and the messy bit in between is what I explore a lot. I probably am less idealistic. There are parts of my personality that are not as light anymore. Again, that's probably a combination of my horrible experience, but also seeing so many things in our democracy under attack. That worries me, and that really hurts my heart and hurts my soul. Also, again, the human rights atrocities inflicted and the dehumanization of Arabs continues to really hurt me. I think probably what I didn't expect, and it's something that comes through in quite a few stories, is how heartbreaking it is to feel deserted. So many of the women felt that friends or peers or people who didn't want to be tarred by association, even if privately they would come up to you and go, I know this is unfair. I know what's happening is wrong. That lack of solidarity from a lot of people with power is really heartbreaking. And that's probably something I'm still digesting. But what's really galvanizing is the amount of regular people, regular Australians, and sometimes with so little to give. I had a pensioner come up to me the other day, and he said to me, when I get my pension next month, I want to subscribe to Et Media, the independent media company Jan and I are running. He's like, but I also donated $10 a month to your legal fees. And so I was just like, that is so beautiful.
Yeah.
And correct. Somebody in the comments said too many careerists in the media. Yes. Too many people who care about their individual short-term gains. And I think that is to the collective loss of Australians.
And that's where we'll leave this week's episode. Thank you so much for joining us. This episode was recorded live on Friday, the 29th of May. To be notified of all our upcoming events, including our Australia's Biggest Book Club series, you can sign up to our newsletter via the link in the show notes. And if you want to support research that powerful interests fear, you can make a tax-deductible donation to the Australia Institute's End of Financial Year Appeal before the 30th of June. You can give now via the link in the show notes. Our theme music is by Jonathan McFeet from Pulse and Thrum, with additional music from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm your host, Ebony Bennett. Thanks for listening.